everyone. I think we're gonna get started. There's a few more people are coming in. So welcome to our tutorial, Thinking Through and Writing About Research Ethics Beyond Broader Impact. We wanna begin by acknowledging how difficult it is to organize a virtual conference. So we wanna thank the organizers for doing such a wonderful job. We also wanna acknowledge how exhausting it can be to stare at a screen all day. So we wanna thank you for making the time for joining us. And we encourage you to pace yourself as you see fit. Feel free to take as many water breaks and whatever other breaks you need. And just to flag at the start, if you need subtitles turned on, you can turn it on at the bottom of the Zoom screen. They're not going to be available during our breakout room, but we hope that you'll be able to access it throughout. If you have any issues, please feel free to reach out and message any one of us. So with that, let's get started. My name is Kate. I'm a PhD researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm joined by my colleagues here, Amelia and Andrew. Do you want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Sure, I'm Amelia Hassoun. I also go by Mia. I'm a PhD candidate at the Oxford Internet Institute, and my background is in anthropology and geography.
Hey, I'm Andrew Brown. I'm a PhD student studying computer vision and machine learning at in the visual geometry group at the University of Oxford.
So what do a sociologist, an anthropologist, and a computer vision researcher have to say about research ethics? This tutorial came out of shared observations we made in our respective fields about research ethics, mainly how we feel constrained by the ways in which AI ethics, research ethics, and broader impacts are being talked about. So this tutorial joins the ongoing conversations in the FAccT and wider socio-technical communities about what it means to do research ethics for AI and ML projects. And we especially invite AI and ML researchers, especially those who are in early career stages as masters and doctoral students, junior and early career researchers, and those of you who are newcomers to AI ethics and tech ethics space, to think more expansively, holistically, and critically about research ethics as it applies to your projects. So to do that, we have a really tight program with us today. We'll start by going over some common misconceptions about research ethics. And then Mia will lead an imaginative exercise that kind of gets your brain rolling. And then the core kind of component of this workshop will be us introducing a Lifecourse approach. And then you'll get an opportunity to apply the Lifecourse approach to the ML research case studies that we have prepared for you in a breakout group. And then we'll end the workshop with a group discussion and talking about the next steps. So what do we mean by research ethics? One way to sketch this out is by considering what we don't mean by research ethics. So in the next few slides, I'm gonna quickly go over some common misconceptions, assumptions, and projections about research ethics that we commonly hear in this space. First and foremost, we commonly hear research ethics equated with broader impact. Broader impact focuses on outcomes, what happens as a result of the project being undertaken. It's one part of the research ethics, but not the whole picture. Research ethics is more expansive and holistic. It asks questions at every stage of conducting a project, from how we position and frame our project, how we collect and use our data, to how we disseminate our findings. Another common misconception is that research ethics is formulaic. There's a single formula that will guarantee you an ethics-proof research design. You get the approval stamp, you never have to think about it again, and you can just move on. AI and ML researchers are not alone in voicing this sentiment. In fact, researchers in the social sciences and humanities share this feeling, especially against the institutionalized ethics committees. Well, there's no one way to do research ethics. It's not a formula that will grant you an ethics-proof research design. It's also not the goal of the ethics review to stamp like an approval of your project as being ethical. Instead, research ethics is a process. We invite you to think about research ethics as a process with signposts that are intended to help you make appropriate and relevant judgment calls throughout the course of your project so that you and your project can be accountable to the choices that you make. There also exists a concern that ethics procedures will censor academic freedom. This is simply not true. In fact, we'd argue that having an ethics process in peer review and conference procedures enriches the rigor and integrity of academic research. For example, at NERDS last year, which was kind of the first to institute this broader impact statement, the committee made it clear that submissions would not be rejected solely on the basis of broader impact statements. And when we look back all the kind of controversial AI and ML research projects that have made the headlines in the past year, ethical concerns exist in tandem with serious methodological and analytical limitations and flaws. So when we hear people equating ethics with censorship, what that tells us is that ethics is considered to be separate from methods. And what we hope to establish by the end of the workshop today is that ethics is inseparable from methods. Another common misconception is that ethics is too subjective. People have different value systems, disciplines have different traditions, countries have different norms. Well, this is all true, but we think letting this relativism argument take the reign to the point of giving up on research ethics altogether is a bit of a cop-out. We think it's helpful to make a distinction between research ethics and ethics more broadly. These two are often conflated as interchangeable, but the specificity of research ethics as a scientific practice gives us a clear direction. We're talking about applying principles to how we conduct scientific research. And these principles have a basis in our disciplinary traditions and expectations of rigor and integrity. So finally, a common misconception about research ethics and AI and ML is that projects that do not involve humans in any direct way have no ethical concerns to worry about. When we hear this, it reveals the assumption that ethics equals humans and that ethics only matters if people are involved or directly harmed. This is at the heart of what we want to discuss today. Rather than assessing research ethics on the presence or absence of human subjects in your project, we want to think about research ethics as an ongoing dialogue about your project's assumptions, methods, limitations, and contributions, the life course of your project.
Thanks, Kate. So along those lines, we're going to get the ball rolling with a little bit of an imaginative exercise. So we'd like you to get out a pen and a piece of paper or open up a blank document. And then what we're going to do is we are going to take 2 minutes, and I want you to think about right now the current project that you're working on or a project that you'd like to do in the future. So just get that project in mind. And then our first exercise will be asking you to think about what it would look like if that project went perfectly. So if your project succeeded beyond your wildest dreams, what steps would go right? What would the results of the project be? Who would benefit? What's the best case scenario of this project? So please take 2 minutes to write this down, and I'll call you back when that time is up. You've got about 10 seconds left, so start wrapping up any final thoughts that you have. And what we'll do is we'll ask anyone who wants to volunteer some examples to just go ahead and drop it in the chat. So if we could just go ahead and generate some of those in the chat. So what does it look like? Like give us some examples of what happens if your project goes perfectly. So what steps go right? What are your results? What benefits? Throw them out there for us. And I know it might have been hard in this particular climate and situation to exercise your utopian imagination, but don't worry, you will get a chance to do the opposite in a second if you're feeling a bit more pessimistic. Okay, get results that help explain the phenomenon. That definitely resonates. Publications, yep. Yeah, that's something that I definitely wrote down when I was doing this exercise as well. Okay, useful in the deployment context. Proud of sharing what you did and how you did it. Nice. Hypotheses validated by findings. So getting a lot on as well on influencing things that come after. So influencing policy regulations, useful in the deployment context. Creating a supportive community of researchers. We have some comments on building models that that work for the thing that you set out to do. Learning from people, test your work in the field, and then go back to the drawing board. Creating an algorithm that is easily implementable for the people that you're designing it for. Okay, these are really great. I want you to hold on to these, and we'll also hold on to the examples as well. Yeah, quantifiable benefits. So getting an articulation of benefits here as well. These are all really, really helpful. So we'll be coming back to this. So so hold on to this exercise, and we'll be talking about it closer to the end, and we'll keep checking in about it. Okay, so now that we had a fun utopian imagination of our projects and what would go right, we're going to do the opposite. So let's take 2 minutes to think about what it would look like if your worst nightmare came to pass. So if things went wrong in your project, what would go wrong? What would happen as a result? Who would be negatively affected, including yourself? So give us 2 minutes on, think for 2 minutes and write about what the worst case scenario is. All right, you've got about 10 seconds left to start wrapping up those final thoughts. And as you're wrapping up, if you'd like to share some of your worst case scenarios in the chat, we would love to hear some of those. So What could go wrong? Okay. Predictions are used by bad actors to impose unwanted changes. So someone takes your research and uses it in a way that you didn't want them to. Worst case, tool doesn't work satisfactorily, makes people laugh. The capabilities are taken too seriously at the risk of promoting misinformation. Okay, and then your research doesn't add anything. You repeat something that's come before. No data access. Okay, so by improving your model, you actually end up harming people from particular backgrounds. People burned out, so you have a negative effect on your researchers. Okay, if someone uses your model in a different way than you use it, the threshold could be chosen so that it could affect access. Doing more harm than good, further ingraining current inequalities. Results are misconstrued by the media. Okay, so we're getting a lot about once you are done with your study, people taking those results and using them in ways that you didn't want them to or intend them to. You have good intentions, but those don't get mapped out, or the work that you do disproportionately affects certain people and benefits certain people. Okay, failing to reach common grounds with partners. All right, these are all really, really helpful. Again, let's hang on to these. We're going to discuss them later, and actually they will help you throughout the workshop. So thank you for participating in this exercise, and we'll continue.
Great, thanks, Mia. So what the imaginative exercise really helps us see is that research is a process with all of our kind of aspirations and worst case scenario worries. So that's why we want to bring in the Lifecourse approach. In sociology, the Lifecourse approach encourages us to think about how individuals' choices and actions interact dynamically with their immediate surroundings and larger social structures. Applied to research ethics, taking a Lifecourse approach to our project allows us to take 4 factors into consideration. First, there are the choices that a researcher makes. And then there are how these choices are shaped by their immediate environment and social structures. So think about your department, funding bodies, disciplinary cultures and norms. And then there's how those environments and systems are part of a larger historical and social context. The pandemic obviously comes to mind as something that's indicative of this particular moment in time that we're all part of. But in relation to the FACT community, there's also the current moment where there's been a real drive to reassess and critically think about the role of technology in our lives. So the kind of conversations that we're having in FACT communities are shaped by these larger environments. And then finally, there's time. Our research often builds on the scholarship of others and will have a life beyond completion, and sometimes in ways that we don't expect or have control over. So taking a Lifecourse approach to our research allows us to consider the individual, the group, the social, and the temporal dynamics that shape our projects. If a research has a Lifecourse, then it's up to the researcher to do their due diligence in ensuring that the Lifecourse of their project is a meaningful one. So what does taking a Lifecourse approach to research ethics actually mean? We're going to learn it by doing it today. So in the next few slides, we're going to briefly sketch out the kind of questions and scenarios that the Lifecourse approach allows us to think about. We'll then direct you to the interactive worksheets that we have prepared for you with the Lifecourse checklist. We'll then assign you 3 separate ML cases, and you're going to apply the Lifecourse checklist to the case studies to think about the different kind of ethical concerns. So we offer a Lifecourse framework for thinking about research ethics, which takes into consideration the Lifecourse of the research project, but also it takes seriously the Lifecourse of the people involved, including the researcher and the people they work with, and the people who participate, in any sense of the word. We've broken down research Lifecourse into 3 phases: the before, the during, and the after. In each phase, we highlight a few principles. And again, everything will be written out in the worksheet you'll be given. So we'll just highlight a few key principles here. So in the before phase, this is where the researcher faces some of the most important ideas about research ethics and has to make a set of decisions that will shape how research unfolds. So a few things that I want to highlight is informed consent and opting out, which are concepts traditionally used in human subject research, but still offers a helpful framework for data-driven research. So the question is less about can individuals consent or opt out, but rather what are the conditions of consent and opting out the researcher is providing. For example, if you're using a data set of profile images from, let's say, a dating app, think about how using that data set conflicts with the app user's expectations of privacy. Another big concern is around the trade-off between identifiability of each data point and the representativeness of the data set. There's a tendency to think that de-identification strategies like anonymization or pseudonymization of the entire data set will kind of resolve this issue altogether, but there's a really important trade-off that we need to think about. So take, for example, if you're using a data set about TikTok users, you might remove all personally identifiable information, including something like age. But this means that your data set now appears homogeneous and can reproduce assumptions about TikTok users primarily being young people. And you're losing out interesting insight into how older people might be using TikTok in really interesting ways. Representativeness of the data set refers to the data set as a whole, but also to how different social groups who are part of the data set are being represented. For example, if a data set about gender and professions, you might have gender parity in terms of count, but you find that your female data points are associated with traditionally feminized and devalued professions, while the male data points have masculinized professions. So in short, teachers for women and professors for men, nurses for women, and doctors for men. So the choices we make as researchers at this phase of the research have a real repercussion on how we're representing the real world and how those representations might have a real impact on the people involved.
Okay, so we're all somewhat used to talking about ethics before we start a project, but ethics review during a project is something that we're probably a little less familiar with, and it's something we're going to talk about today. So in the projects that we do, as we all know probably too well, and as we explored in the writing exercise that we did at the beginning, things rarely, if ever, go exactly as planned. As a result, it's really important to think about ethics during the life course of a project. So how can you keep checking whether the initial ethical framework that you came up with at the beginning of the project is still appropriate during the project as things change? So for example, one of the points that we bring up here is the question of ongoing review. So asking if you have processes to review the project during its duration to identify and fix anything that's not working as anticipated. Also then asking the follow-up questions of who gets to participate in these processes and who is able to raise a concern during research. So for example, we can go to risk exposure and talk about whether if you discover that people, whether they're the participants or the people working on the project, are exposed to more risk through the research than you anticipated at the beginning, how you can make changes to safeguard them. Also, when we think about ethics, we often think about people directly participating in the study or people whose data we're using, but we often overlook the well-being of people who are working on the project themselves. So we joke about us PhD students sleeping in the lab or answering emails at all hours, but if we think about researchers as workers, which we suggest that we should, we also need to protect them from exploitation and overwork and make sure they're able to speak up and seek help when they need it. So these are just a few questions that we need to consider during the research phase of the life course.
So the final part of the life course that we'll talk about is after the project. And this is often a part that people don't think about when doing ethics reviews. You're done with your research, you think it's all over, but your research lives on and you need to plan for that. So first, there's accessibility of results. Where will you publish these results and which groups will have access to them? If your results and findings are widely accessible to anyone, as is often the case in the machine learning community, then how are you making the limitations of your work clear to the different audiences that might have different levels of knowledge? For usability, who do the results or findings of the project benefit? Who is left out from being able to use or benefit from your projects? The immediate impacts are sometimes quite clear. Who might be the beneficiaries of the immediate impacts and who might be negatively affected? Like I said before, the future applications is important. You might be done with your research, but it lives on. How can you do your due diligence to ensure that it carries on a safe path? Possible misuses is very important. So it's very important to consider how your research could serve purposes other than those that you originally intended when doing the research. This isn't necessarily to counter some specific malicious actor, but instead, how are you helping other researchers to act ethically and think thoroughly when they're using your research? Limitations. So after having gone through the life course of the project, you can finally reflect on the research and think, what are the actual possible benefits and limitations of this work? And honesty is key here. So now that we've gone through the life course, we're going to enter a short few-minute break. If I can get the next slide, please. There we go. So everyone relax, grab a drink, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Activity. We're going to split everyone into breakout rooms and give each group a machine learning case study to practice applying the life course approach that we just discussed before the break. Once you enter the breakout room, we're going to give you a link to the life course worksheet. Now we've made it really easy for you guys. We've distilled all of the information that we just went through into this nice, easy, interactable worksheet. This is going to have details of the case study and should answer any questions that you have. As your group, go through the case study and the instructions, and then answer the questions on the worksheet in relation to the case study. So fill out the worksheet together and feel free to write on it, interact with it, whatever you want. So after the breakout group discussion, we're all going to return to the big group and share any of the answers to the questions that people have. We're going to raise any difficulties, any challenges that we found in relation to the different case studies, and have a good discussion as a group. So I'm now going to go through the 3 different case studies that each of the breakout rooms are going to have. This is so everyone has an idea of all of the different case studies that people are looking at. But don't worry, all of the details for your case study will be given to you in your breakout room. So the 3 machine learning case studies we're looking at today are face recognition, action recognition, and a task in a simulated environment. Now, we chose these because they raise very different ethical concerns. So the first case study is face recognition. I'm sure all of you or most of you have heard of this. So the goal here is to recognize if any 2 face images correspond to the same person. The method here is to train a machine learning algorithm on a data set of human faces. Now, this has some obvious potential uses. There's testing out new machine learning algorithms, recognizing people in photo albums, TV shows, social media, biometric identification, and also surveillance. So with each of the case studies that we're giving you guys, we give you a more info section, and this should contain any relevant information for going through the worksheet. And some relevant information here is that the data set contains face images from over 500,000 well-known celebrities. And we include some statistics about the people represented in that data set. So the next case study is on action recognition. So maybe less of you have heard of this task, but it's a very common, popular task in computer vision. So the goal here is to recognize specific human actions in videos. Your method here again will be to train a machine learning algorithm on a data set of videos of specific human actions. The potential uses here are identifying and classifying human behavior for recommender systems, or also automatically detecting suspicious activities for law enforcement. Some relevant extra information that we include here includes that all of the videos are automatically downloaded from YouTube that make up the data sets. The third case study is the task in the simulated environments. And the goal of this specific task in this case study is train a machine learning algorithm to drive a car. The method here will be to train the algorithm in a simulated environment such as the game Grand Theft Auto. The idea is to give the agent the task of driving without crashing and to obey the highway code in the game environment. The big potential use of this case study is self-driving vehicles. The idea is to have the agent use its knowledge learned in the simulated environment in the real world. engineers could expect the agent to be able to drive in environments similar to those seen in the simulated environments. So important extra context here is that all data is generated from what the agent does in the human-made simulated environments. And this is an example of a powerful machine learning technique called reinforcement learning. So the research in this case study would involve the development and advancement of these techniques. Don't worry if this is a lot of information and details. It will be also on the worksheet that we give you in your breakout rooms, and we'll include all relevant information that you'll need to answer the questions. So I'm now going to go through the instructions for going into the breakout room. So we're now sorting everyone into the breakout rooms. Each breakout room, when you get put in it, will get a worksheet containing 3 things. First, instructions for what to do in the breakout rooms, the case study description that you guys will be working on, and the Lifecourse checklist that we've prepared. In your teams, read through the instructions, read through the case study description, and skim over the checklist. A good idea is to use the checklist as a guide to discuss the ethical concerns in relation to the case study. And remember, you can write on it, interact with it, the worksheet is yours. In each group, we ask you assign 3 roles. First, a facilitator to get the discussion going and to keep it going. Secondly, a timekeeper to keep track of time, and we'll give some time details at the end of this slide. And a reporter to relay your group's discussion to everyone. Some discussion points that we're interested in the group discussion afterwards are, for example, the question that you guys found most difficult to answer on the worksheet. Also, the question that you found most novel, or in other words, the one that you hadn't encountered or thought of before. Also, the key takeaway or talking point from the experience, or the most interesting answer that you had in relation to the case study. So after that, we're going to reconvene as a big group to discuss the key takeaways and observations. During the breakout group, if you have any questions about the case study, what you're supposed to be doing, anything, you can ask us for help by pressing the question mark on the bottom of the Zoom screen. And one of us will drop into the breakout room and answer any questions that you guys might have. The breakout room will last for roughly 25 minutes, and this is followed by another 5-minute break. And then after that, we have the big group discussion. We'll message all of the different breakout rooms with timings of when it's coming to an end, and so on. So I'm now gonna stop sharing my screen, and we will go into the different breakout rooms.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming back. So we're going to take the rest of about 15 minutes now, plus in the rest of the session, to discuss your findings. So if the rapporteur from group 1 on facial recognition could let us know, and I'm pasting into the chat again the 3 questions, that would be great. So jump on in, unmute yourself, and let us know what your group came up with.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that stood out in our conversation was how difficult it was to move past the before section of the research life course. So, spending the whole time identifying significant factors that would kind of force you to refuse to do the research in some ways, or to identify kind of just framing characteristics that prevent any kind of ethical application downstream from the ratio of the potential negative consequences to maybe some small positive applications, to the mode that the information was collected in and how people were able to consent or opt out, or kind of self-identify and determine their representation in it. So I think we spent a lot of our discussion in that part of the research life course. And especially thinking within there, I guess we spent some time thinking about exposure to risk. So that was in the during section. We were kind of, thinking separate a little bit maybe from the specific context of this case study, but how are thinking about exposure to risk from data subjects whose likenesses or representations were just taken from the internet without much thought or context or establishment of the processes there. Yeah, the second question, the most novel, or I guess, sorry, the exposure to risk was kind of thinking about that. And yeah, I think a key takeaway or talking point was, again, to come back to this focusing kind of on the before the research project part of the life course, and the imperative of spending a lot of time thinking about the kind of prerequisites and requirements there to even conducting a research study, because once something begins, there's a lot more institutional or financial pressure to maybe continue, organizational pressure, and also, the creation of even a data set in the first place, as many people have written about and commented, has a lifetime existence outside of just that specific project. So I don't know if anyone else from my group wanted to jump in too.
You're also welcome. We encourage you to carry on a separate or like a conversation in the chat in parallel, because we know these workshops are quite short. So if you have anything to add to your main speaker, go ahead and also drop that in the chat. Thanks, Jeffrey, that was great. So we'll move on to group 2, which also did, next we'll do group 4. So the second facial recognition group. And also don't feel limited by the 3 questions. Those were just there to help you generate. But if you want to share something else about your experience, go for it. Thanks.
Great. I think we were group 4. We also did the facial recognition. Just to give context for folks, so this was a project where you're trying to identify 2 of the same faces, and the data set that you used was a data set of celebrities, and it was primarily actors and American actors. So for us, one of the questions that we found most difficult to answer really was about opting in informed consent. Really questions around, well, these are celebrities, right? How do we contact them and tell them they're in this data set? Will they really even care? Will they even respond to us? So yeah, thinking about how do we even give consent in that situation. We ended up staying mostly in the before section as well, because there were so many questions. And I'll give it off to anyone else in the group to talk about, novel questions. We had a question about like even data safety and data storage as well. Yeah, I'll pass it off to anyone else in the group.
Yeah, I can jump in. I was in the group, and I guess in terms of questions that jumped out to me that I hadn't seen before were all the questions about labor of researchers, how to ensure that that people work the number of hours that's consistent with labor laws, and I guess that's very difficult to ensure. I mean, just because there is this culture of overwork in academia in general. And there are very strong incentives to overwork. So it feels very much like, as one researcher, it's very hard to do much to combat the general structural problems. So I mean, that jumped out to me, and it's something that I think we don't think about often.
Great, thanks. So then it would be great if we could hear from group 2. So that's the first action recognition group.
Hey y'all, my name is Dylan. I'm the raconteur for the second group. So yeah, similar to Jeffrey, we fell for the pretty glaring pitfall of spending a lot of time talking about the ethical considerations in the life course considerations in the before phase. In particular, we were talking through maybe more than we should have, some of the technical details for how we might go about scraping some of this data when it comes to the contacting process. But I think we came up with some really interesting ideas, and it was fun to thresh them out with the group, specifically talking about ways of using the data available on YouTube to compile a list of contact information and decide which of those forms is the best for reaching out to a particular person. I think one of the areas that we found most difficult to grapple with came down to whether or not we were going to take an opt-in versus opt-out approach. And it seems to be pretty, there's an ideological aspect to it. There's a lot of value judgments that get made in terms of deciding which of those to do in absence of legal requirements, which maybe speaks to the power that those legal requirements can have in terms of forcing process. At the same time, there were a little bit of discussion that we had in terms of ways that we could prototype some proof of concepts out, and maybe using less of an opt-in approach, but then maybe when it's time to build something a little bit more robust, you want that security and guarantee that if you're building something that's going to be out in the wild, that it's built with reasonable consent in mind. I'll pause there, but if anybody else from the group, Ankur or Laura, have any additional contributions, I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Dylan. Let's go then to group 5, so the second action recognition group. And again, please feel free to jump in the chat if anyone has anything to add. But yeah, group 5.
All right, well, I'm representing group 5. In terms of the most difficult question that we had to answer, I think it revolved around the risks involved in the people participating in the research. I think that was very similar to what Jeff brought up, where we were thinking, if they anonymize the data or, they're not identifying the people in the video, what's the risk are there any inherent risks? And then also thinking, someone in our group, I think it was our guest, had brought up the fact that, are there risks if in Iran you can't dance, but there was some way to attribute that this video was from somebody, even though it's been anonymized, whether or not, there's something that we're just not thinking of. And then in terms of the most novel questions, we had one around both. We often think about the people involved in the data, but there's also, we should consider almost the researchers themselves in case there are any consequences to them. Let's say if there's issues with, or there's controversy around this study and then it gets taken out on the researchers who are just essentially doing their job, although I think Carmen in the group can speak a little bit more if she wants to elaborate. And then also there was also questions around the usage of the data, that it's very subjective. Yeah, it could be used for, let's say, performance enhancement to improve athlete performance, or it could be used by law enforcement. It really depends on the context to see whether or not this is a good use of this data and what we're doing with it. And then in terms of key takeaways, I think what really stuck out to our group was that different cultures have different interpretations of actions. So I know one of the prompts was that, okay, what's considered suspicious activities and whether or not something that you might consider suspicious and maybe on YouTube, which might be more North American centric, might be interpreted differently, or people with, maybe more able-bodied people are shown on YouTube that things that maybe disabled people do differently might be considered suspicious. So yeah, I'm not, if anybody else in our group wants to add anything, feel free.
Thanks, Cindy. Okay, we'll run ahead though to group 3 then, so we can get to our simulated environment. So group 3.
Yeah, I'll be reporting for group 3. So this was about using a simulated environment such as the video game Grand Theft Auto as a testing ground for training an agent to drive a car and the potential uses self-driving vehicles. And so something that was interesting here is that the task setup says that there's no human data. We're basically just using a video game environment. But like one of the things that we were thinking about was like we kept wanting to go beyond the framework of informed consent and impact, just beyond the data and into like what happens if and when this algorithm gets deployed in a real car in the real world. And so we were thinking about what are the implications for like right of way and traffic laws and different conditions and like what scripts and languages might be on the traffic signs, et cetera. Like all these things that are like a lot more locally specific that might not generalize well for an algorithm that's trained on Grand Theft Auto. And we also talked about like the potential for harmful behavioral stereotypes about different driving agents in Grand Theft Auto. I think we didn't have enough information to speak more thoughtfully on that, but yeah, I think yeah, the kind of trend was that we kept wanting to answer questions that weren't specifically in the framework, but wanting to broaden the scope and change some of the definitions of things to include not just like the data considerations, but also the algorithmic recourse and considerations for releasing not just the data, but the models, and potential for trying to make it so that, for example, someone who wanted access to the models would have to, reach out and give justification for why they wanted to use it instead of making it publicly available. And yeah, I think that's kind of like the broader themes of what we talked about. Sorry, I guess folks, you can put in the chat if there was something I missed.
That's great. And those are really, really important considerations that we were actually really hoping would come up. So thank you so much for discussing those and thinking about those. Group 6, would you like to round us off?
Yes, can you hear me well? So in group 6, we talked a bit about similar topics where thinking about who would be using the models and what assumptions we're making about that. So whether that would be big companies, whether that would be individual, like teenagers, and what that means about the limitations and accessibility. But we actually spent a lot of time on section 2. And I would say that was the most difficult for us because we started talking about labor rights of researchers and how to communicate limitations when they come up and about the power structures, and had very few good answers. We've sort of mostly agreed that there were problems, and it seemed that it was really hard to come up with something that, on the lab level, many things wouldn't be sufficient if labs are small, but on the university level, sort of pushing some like HR issues all the way up also seemed excessive. And similarly with having reviews of the research that we're doing, how do we do it in a way that allows people at different levels in the pecking order to sort of bring up their issues? I didn't expect that part to be as difficult as it was. I've realized thinking through it that we often focus on the before and after much more than we do on the during, even though we spend the majority of our time in the during. If anyone else in the group wants to add anything. Oh, one more thing that came up on the limitations. The idea of publishing the issues that you run into, right, so that others don't have to repeat them. And similarly, if there is a point where maybe we should decide to abandon the project, being able to publish about this is something that would be a great, it would be great if an avenue like that existed. And I know that it's been brought up in the sciences in general about publishing that your study didn't go right, but especially with ethical limitations, it seems like something that would be very interesting for people to see too.
Thank you so much. And it's almost as though you read our minds, because the thing we wanted to spend the last 5 minutes on was asking this question that actually you just raised, which is, and already started us off with some really great ideas toward it, which is what conventions stop us from easily being able to write about and share the ethical implications of our research, and then what we could do to change this. So one of the things we wanted to do just with the last 5 minutes here is open up, first of all, the chat so we can talk synchronously since we don't have much time, but anyone who also wants to jump in and discuss some of these things. So for this example, right, in the during phase and for the after and before. So if we think back to the writing that you did at the beginning, a lot of the concerns that came up in both the utopian and dystopian imaginary was about what would happen to your research after the fact. So how can we think of ways in which we can maybe change the processes that currently exist to bring these kinds of considerations into more common discussion? So if anyone wants to pick up on that, please drop some ideas into the chat or go ahead and unmute and speak up.
Oh, sorry. Are we also allowed to talk in addition to the chat typing?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was gonna say, I really liked the point at the beginning about how kind of questioning like whose ethics or like whose, this isn't generalizable to all contexts is a sort of a cop-out, because I think like one thing that we can do is, to have really explicit positionality and stance statements. And like those too can be, critiqued within disciplinary traditions or held to certain standards, but like that can be a part of the framing of like, here's the ethical guidelines we're using, or here's the particular context in which we're assessing this. Because yeah, I agree that like in my own, work with people who talk about ethics, like that's the one thing that they keep bringing up, like, oh, what's the point? Like this isn't generalizable to all cultures and all cultural contexts. And like, I think we can, situate ourselves a little bit better and more rigorously, and that itself can also be discussed and critiqued, etc.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm just throwing up because unfortunately we only have a few minutes left. Just some of the ideas that we also had, and you guys are coming up with some really great stuff in the chat. Kate, with the last minute of the session, is there any sign off that you'd like to do? Sadly, that we can't stay for longer because you guys have been amazing and this has been super generative.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to say that this has been an incredible discussion. We wish that we could have had a full day in person to really kind of go deeper into the worksheet, but we encourage you to share information with your breakout groups and go through the checklist that you didn't get to. And we hope that this can kind of continue to generate conversations with your breakout group peers, but also something you can bring back to your own community. And it sounds like our conversation naturally segued into, what are the things in our immediate environments that we can implement to make sure that these conversations become part of a disciplinary norm. So Mia has a slide out now. So these are just a few of our ideas of what you can do. I'll just kind of quickly gloss over them, but there are things that everyone can do, which is, creating a culture where limitation discussions are honest and openly received. And then there are things for people with decision-making capacity as reviewers, as instructors and teachers, as principal investigators, that they can do in their own positions to make sure that this is something that's implemented into how we think and talk and perform our research. And with that, that concludes our workshop today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to contact us. We're happy to keep this conversation going. And I have shared the slides on the chat. We will liaise with the FAccT conveners to see if we can share them with people who might have missed the links, but I'll reshare it in the group right now.
You can also go ahead and head over to the community area in the conference hub, and you can post the links there. If you want to go ahead and make a post there, Kate or Amelia or Andrew, and you can make the links available there.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.